Welcome, everyone. We're about to jump into the making of Islam, but maybe not in the way you've heard it before. We're going to peel back the layers of the sacred story for a bit. What we want to explore is the human story underneath. You know, the one shaped by the intense politics, the conflicts, the cultures of 7th century Arabia.
Right. So less about a purely divine revelation from the sky and more about how an idea on the ground grew into a massive empire. I'm really looking forward to getting into this.
Exactly. And our starting point is actually a fascinating observation from within Islamic tradition itself. It says, what is said to the elite jurists should not be said to the common people. I mean, think about that. For centuries, there's been this idea of two versions of the story, one for the experts and one for everyone else.
Wow, that's a huge deal. So I guess the big question we're asking today is, what happens when we open that door? What does that elite history actually look like?
So, we've broken down our journey into 5 key parts. We'll start with this idea of a hidden history, then look at the calculated beginnings in Mecca. After that, we'll see how a state was born in Medina, how the empire got a major rebrand in Damascus, and we'll wrap up by looking at the unfinished legacy of it all.
Okay, so a tour through the cities that really built the Islamic world. Let's do it.
All right, Section 1, Islam's hidden history. Where do we even begin with something like that?
Well, the first step, and this is probably the most important one, is to try and set our emotions aside. The goal here isn't to praise Islam or to attack it. It's just to understand it. To do that, you have to look at the history critically, like you would with any other major historical event.
Okay, this really lays out the two different ways of looking at it. You've got the traditional narrative, which sees it as this sacred, divinely guided story.
Right.
And then you have the historical analysis, which sees it as a very human story. It suggests that Islam isn't just the culmination of history, but a product of it. It was shaped by everything happening at the time, the politics, the economy, the tribal warfare. And with this lens, you don't get to skip the embarrassing parts. You have to look at everything to see the full picture.
Okay, let's dive into Mecca. What was the world actually like when Islam first appeared? What's the setting for this story?
Yeah, this is so important. It was anything but a quiet, isolated desert. Think of it more like a pressure cooker. Islam emerged right in the middle of a world stage that was being torn apart by 2 superpowers, the Byzantine Roman Empire and the Persian Sasanian Empire. And they were locked in this brutal existential war.
And you can see on this timeline just how chaotic things were. Starting around 602, these two empires are just hammering each other in this devastating, decades-long war.
And look at that date, 622 AD. That's the year of the Hijra, when Muhammad moves to Medina. It's happening at the exact same time that the Byzantines are starting to push the Persians back. Then, just a few years later, the war ends, and both empires are just shattered.
Exhausted.
Exactly.
Which creates this enormous power vacuum right on Arabia's doorstep. The timing is just incredible.
So given that backdrop of total war and collapsing empires, what was the purpose of this new message? Was it purely spiritual? Well, that's the traditional view, right? That it was a spiritual message for all of humanity. But the analysis we're looking at today suggests something else was going on. It argues the primary goal was actually a geopolitical project, a way to finally unify all these constantly feuding Arab tribes. The doctrine, the religion, was the cement needed to bind them all together into one powerful force.
That's a really different way of looking at it. So Mecca wasn't some backwater town in the desert, completely cut off from the world?
Not at all. The influence from the big empires was everywhere. For instance, Mecca's political setup, organized by Qusay bin Khalid, was basically modeled on a Roman Senate. Even the name Quraysh, Muhammad's tribe, might come from a Syriac word for Arab tribes who were allied with, you guessed it, Byzantium.
Okay, so what about Mecca's religious importance? I always heard it was because of the Kaaba and monotheism.
Well, according to this analysis, Mecca's power wasn't about monotheism at all, at least not at first. It was about pluralism. It housed over 360 different tribal gods. That made it a religious hub for everyone, which was fantastic for controlling the trade routes. It was a business model.
Okay, that brings up a really big question for me then. If the goal was to unify the Arabs, and Mecca was this hub of politics and trade, why did the message struggle so much there? I mean, 13 years with only a handful of followers? It doesn't quite add up.
That is the question. And the answer, or at least the historical shift that happens next, is what changes everything.
Right. The move to Medina. What was so different about Medina? What changed? This is where the entire project pivots.
We're often told the Hijra was about escaping persecution, a desperate flight for safety. But if you look at it through a political lens, it looks much more like a calculated, strategic move. It's the moment a social religious movement decides to become a state-building enterprise.
So really, we have to redefine the Hijra. It's not just a migration, it's a strategic relocation. It's the moment the focus shifts from preaching to consolidating political and military power.
So it's less about running away and more about finding a better base of operations to build an actual state. With alliances, a military, and a solid economic strategy.
And once in Medina, the strategy becomes crystal clear. Step 1. Forge alliances. Unite with the local tribes, the Aus and Khazraj, and also pull in all these disenfranchised warriors floating around, the Salik.
Okay, so get your manpower sorted. What's step 2?
Step 2 is crucial. Control the economy. And you do that by taking control of the caravan routes that feed Mecca. You choke off their supply lines, including the port that supplied their grain.
And step 3, I'm guessing, is building the army?
Exactly. You use the raids and the promise of spoils, of loot, to attract more followers. It creates this powerful feedback loop. The more you raid, the more spoils you get, the more warriors you attract, the more you can raid. It's a formula for rapid growth.
Yeah, the Moroccan philosopher Muhammad Abd al-Jabri really nailed it. He called it a new model based on a trilogy: faith, tribe, and spoils. Faith provides the unifying ideology, the tribe provides the soldiers, and the spoils provide the funding. That's a pretty powerful combination. No wonder it took off in Medina when it had stalled in Mecca.
And thinking about it this way completely changes how you see the birth of Sharia, of Islamic law.
How so? I thought it was understood as a set of timeless, divine rules.
Well, this perspective argues that it didn't start that way. It suggests that the birth of Sharia was basically the birth of a state of emergency. It was practical, on-the-ground legislation for a society that was constantly at war. It was about how to divide spoils, how to keep military discipline, how to manage a growing state in real time.
Okay, so after Muhammad's death, the movement he built is now a real power. Logically, you'd think his closest companions, the people who were with him from the start, would be the ones to lead it forward.
That's what anyone would expect. But what happens next is one of the most shocking twists in this entire story. The people who end up in charge are not his closest followers, but his oldest, most powerful enemies, the Umayyad clan.
Wait, hold on. You're telling me the very same Meccan elites, the Umayyads, who fought Muhammad tooth and nail because he was a threat to their business and their power, they are the ones who end up inheriting his entire project?
That's exactly what happened. It's an absolutely stunning irony. They take over the movement they once fought and use its energy to build their own dynastic empire, moving the capital out of Arabia to Damascus.
And it's really under the Umayyads, especially a caliph named Abd al-Malik, that Islam gets branded and formalized as an official state religion. He's the one who commissions the first official, standardized written Quran. He builds massive imperial symbols like the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem, specifically to rival the Christian holy sites.
So he's building the infrastructure of the religion, making Arabic the official language, minting the first Islamic coins, and most importantly, using the religion to say, our family's rule is divinely approved. This is basically the moment Islam gets corporate.
So as we wrap up, we're left with this really complex legacy. It feels like the entire story, from the very beginning, is defined by this constant tug of war between the ideals of the religious message and the realities of raw political power. That's a fantastic way to summarize it. That tension is at the heart of everything. And that brings us to the central takeaway of this whole discussion. The point is that history is not just some optional footnote to religion. It's the soil the religion grew out of. And understanding that human political context isn't an attack on faith. It's absolutely essential to understanding what the faith actually is.
Right. The history isn't secondary, it's the foundation.
And this source argues that growing out of this soil created two deep, foundational contradictions that have really defined Islamic history ever since. The first is that tension between a doctrine that talks about social justice and the political reality of an empire built on conquest and hierarchy.
And the second is the clash between the beautiful idea of a single, unified Muslim nation, the Ummah, and the stubborn, persistent reality of tribal politics and power struggles that have led to conflict again and again.
So we'll leave you with a final question to think about. What changes for you when you look at this history, not as a perfect, sacred story that came down from heaven, but as a complex, messy, and deeply human one that grew up from the earth?
Something to really chew on. Thanks for listening, everyone.